Let me begin with a question that should immediately command our attention. What does it mean when secret missiles, developed in silence and deployed without warning, change the balance of an entire region overnight? This is not just another headline in a long series of Middle Eastern conflicts. This is a watershed moment, a turning point that speaks volumes about the shifting dynamics of global power, the fragility of empires, and the dangerous arrogance of assuming technological and military superiority guarantees safety. When we talk about the unveiling of secret Yemeni missiles used for the very first time in the recent attack on Tel Aviv's fuel warehouses, we are not simply talking about another act of war in an already volatile region. We are witnessing a dramatic shift in the balance of power, one that forces us to re-examine long-held assumptions about who holds the technological advantage, who dictates the pace of conflict, and who ultimately defines the narrative of strength in the Middle East. This moment is not only about the physical destruction caused by those missiles, it is about what they represent. They symbolize the emergence of a new player with unexpected capabilities, and that alone has the power to unsettle governments, militaries, and populations across the globe. The first hook we must consider is the element of surprise. For years, Yemen was dismissed as too impoverished, too war-torn, too devastated by internal strife and external intervention to ever develop or deploy advanced weapons technology. Yet out of that rubble and against overwhelming odds, Yemen has introduced a missile system that reached the very heart of Israel. Surprise is the currency of modern warfare, and Yemen has cashed in with devastating effect. The question now is not only how these weapons were built and hidden, but how they were able to be shielded from one of the most sophisticated intelligence networks in the world. Israel, supported by U.S. intelligence and surveillance, prides itself on knowing threats before they emerge. This strike revealed a blind spot so large it cannot be ignored. Consider the psychological impact. When nations believe they have perfect awareness of their adversaries, their populations feel secure, their militaries feel confident, and their leaders feel justified in their strategies. But when a hidden arsenal suddenly surfaces, when weapons nobody anticipated are unleashed, that confidence collapses. And with it comes fear, hesitation, and the urgent sense that the rules of engagement have changed overnight. Yemen, a nation often regarded as the underdog, has turned its invisibility into power. It has shown that sometimes the most dangerous weapons are not those we can see, but those we fail to imagine. The second hook lies in the message this sends to the broader region. If Yemen can unveil a new generation of missiles, what does this imply about other nations under similar pressures? What does this say about Iran's support, about clandestine networks of knowledge and technology transfer that may be thriving despite sanctions and blockades? It suggests that what happened in Tel Aviv may not be an isolated event, but rather the first chapter of a larger story where non-traditional actors wield increasing influence. Israel and its allies are now forced to ask how many more secret arsenals are out there. This uncertainty is as destabilizing as the missiles themselves. And then there is the symbolism of first use. Whenever a weapon is used for the first time, it is more than a strike. It is a declaration. It says, we have crossed a threshold, we are capable of escalation, and we are willing to do so. For Yemen, this was not just about destroying a fuel depot. It was about signaling that it has matured into a force with long-range strike capacity, capable of reaching deep into enemy territory and forcing adversaries to play defense. First use is always a turning point in military history. Think of the first time drones were deployed in modern conflicts, or the first time cyber attacks crippled infrastructure. These moments redefine what is possible. Yemen's missiles have now joined that list. From a geopolitical perspective, this unveiling is even more consequential. It undermines the decades-long assumption that advanced weapons could be monopolized by wealthier, more technologically advanced states. In reality, asymmetric warfare has once again proven that innovation thrives under adversity. Sanctions, blockades, and isolation may weaken economies, but they also breed resilience, creativity, and a drive to develop capabilities that defy expectations. Yemen's new missiles are not just weapons, They are the embodiment of resistance and adaptation. They remind us that even in the margins of global power, strength can emerge in unexpected and profoundly disruptive ways. Finally, we must consider the wider implications for global security. If Yemen could conceal and then reveal such weapons, what confidence can the world place in its intelligence systems, in its alliances, in its doctrines of deterrence? This single event exposes a dangerous reality in an interconnected and unstable world. No amount of surveillance, no investment in defense, no alliance structure can guarantee safety. That vulnerability, now exposed in Tel Aviv, reverberates far beyond Israel. It echoes in Washington, in Riyadh, in Moscow, and in every capital that thought it had calculated the risks of war in the Middle East. This is why the unveiling of these secret Yemeni missiles matters. It is not just another battle, not just another headline. It is a crack in the armor of certainty, a reminder that the underdog can bite, and a warning that the future of conflict will not always be decided by the biggest budgets or the strongest armies. The future belongs to those who can innovate in silence and strike when least expected. When we examine the decision to strike Tel Aviv's fuel warehouses, the significance of the target becomes clear almost immediately. This was not a random act of destruction, nor was it an impulsive strike meant merely to provoke headlines. It was a calculated choice designed to inflict maximum symbolic, economic, and military damage with one move. Fuel is not just another commodity, it is the bloodstream of any modern nation, particularly one as heavily reliant on military operations and industrial capacity as Israel. Without energy reserves, tanks do not move, aircraft do not fly, industries cannot function, and civilian life begins to falter. By aiming at fuel depots, Yemen's strike was not only about setting fire to infrastructure, it was about demonstrating the power to disrupt an entire way of life. The hook here is the precision of the symbolism. Fuel warehouses represent far more than barrels of oil or gasoline. They are the physical embodiment of continuity, of stability, of daily life running without interruption. By hitting these warehouses, Yemen did not just hit Israel's economy, it struck at the psyche of the nation. When citizens see flames leaping from fuel reserves, they see vulnerability where once they believed there was security. They see the possibility that tomorrow their cars may not run, their flights may be canceled, their military may not be as omnipotent as once believed. That kind of psychological disruption is often more powerful than the immediate material loss. We also need to think about the cascading effects of such a strike. Fuel depots are nodes in a vast network that sustains not just the military but also civilian infrastructure. Destroy one node and you disrupt the system that depends on it. Suddenly, supply chains grow uncertain, reserves dwindle, and panic creeps in. Panic has an economic cost. Fuel prices rise, black markets expand, and investors lose confidence. Insurance companies that cover energy infrastructure raise premiums. Shipping firms recalculate their risks, and the ripple spreads from Tel Aviv to Dubai, from Dubai to London, from London to New York. This is why the strike matters far beyond the borders of Israel. It sends tremors through the global economy. A burning fuel depot in Tel Aviv is not just a local crisis. It is a reminder that the world's energy and economic systems are interconnected and fragile. But there is also a deeper message in the choice of this target. Militaries are accustomed to attacks on bases, convoys, or troop positions. They are less accustomed to adversaries striking critical infrastructure deep inside urban areas, far from the front lines. That is a new kind of warfare. It redefines what is fair game, what is vulnerable, and what must be defended. By forcing Israel to defend not just its borders but its internal lifelines, Yemen has expanded the battlefield. Suddenly, the home front is no longer secure. Suddenly, Tel Aviv itself is a theater of war. This changes the calculus for Israeli leaders who now face the prospect of fighting wars not only abroad but at home, with their civilian population watching the consequences unfold in real time. The hook grows sharper when we consider the timing. This was not an accident of opportunity, it was a deliberate strike during a period when tensions were already high. In moments like these, symbols matter more than strategy alone. The burning of fuel warehouses was a spectacle designed to be seen, to be broadcast to reverberate across media outlets worldwide. It was as much about the image as about the flames themselves. And in a world where images can be more powerful than weapons, this act was a masterstroke of psychological and political warfare. Let us also acknowledge the restraint implied by the target. Yemen did not strike civilian neighborhoods or religious sites. It struck infrastructure directly tied to Israel's military and economic strength. That sends a message of calculation, not recklessness. It signals that Yemen is not lashing out blindly but acting with purpose. That purpose is to show that even the most secure lifelines are not beyond reach, that Israel's deterrence is not as absolute as it once believed, and that future strikes could be equally disruptive if political and military conditions demand it. The broader implication is this: every time a smaller power demonstrates the capacity to disrupt the logistical and economic backbone of a larger power, the myth of invincibility is shattered. Israel has long cultivated the image of a state protected by cutting edge technology, advanced intelligence, and a powerful alliance with the United States. And yet, the smoke rising from Tel Aviv's fuel warehouses tells a different story, a story of vulnerability, of exposure, and of the real limits of military supremacy in an era of asymmetric warfare. The attack was a statement: your lifeblood can be drained, your power can be interrupted, and your strength can be questioned. That is why the strike on Tel Aviv's fuel depots will be remembered not simply as an act of destruction, but as a carefully chosen move in a wider chess game, one that has already reshaped the calculations of every player in the region. The psychological and strategic shock delivered by the Yemeni missile strike cannot be overstated, because what unfolded in Tel Aviv was not just an act of war, it was an assault on the very foundation of perceived security. Nations like Israel have built their reputations, their confidence, and even their foreign policy postures on the assumption of military invulnerability. They operate under the belief that their highly sophisticated defense systems, their alliances with global powers, and their unmatched surveillance capabilities provide them with a shield that cannot be pierced. Yet, in one night, that shield cracked. A missile fired from Yemen did not simply explode in Tel Aviv. It exploded inside the minds of military strategists, political leaders, and ordinary citizens alike, who suddenly realized that the fortress was not impenetrable after all. The hook here is the collapse of certainty. In geopolitics, perception is as critical as reality. For years, Israel has projected an aura of dominance, assuring its people that enemies could be held at bay and that cutting-edge missile defense systems like the Iron Dome could intercept almost anything thrown their way. When Yemen's missiles slipped through and ignited critical infrastructure, that aura dimmed. The people watching in Tel Aviv saw more than flames. They saw doubt, and doubt spreads faster than fire. It creeps into boardrooms, into cabinet meetings, into the daily conversations of ordinary families who suddenly wonder if they are as safe as they were told. Strategically, this shock forces a recalibration. Military doctrines are built on predictability, knowing the enemy's capacity, understanding their weapons, and planning for the scenarios you believe are possible. But when an adversary reveals a weapon you never anticipated, all those doctrines are instantly outdated. Israeli defense planners are now scrambling to account for a new threat that was not even on their radar, which means they must allocate resources, adjust strategies, and reconsider their timelines for action. That process is costly, disorienting, and fraught with uncertainty. And uncertainty, in the middle of a volatile regional conflict, is as dangerous as the weapons themselves. Think of the signal this sends to the wider world. If Israel, often hailed as having one of the most advanced military intelligence ecosystems on the planet, can be blindsided, then who else is vulnerable? What other nations, confident in their technological superiority, might be exposed by adversaries who innovate in silence? This question echoes far beyond the Middle East. It resonates in Washington, in Brussels, in every capital where policymakers assume their defenses are impenetrable. The Yemeni strike becomes not just a regional story, but a global parable about the risks of complacency and overconfidence. The deeper shock lies in the psychological balance of power. For decades, Israel has sought to maintain deterrence, a condition in which enemies are too fearful of retaliation to risk an attack. Deterrence depends on belief, the belief that striking Israel would bring swift and overwhelming consequences. Yet, when Yemen dared to launch this unprecedented attack and achieved visible success, it weakened that belief. Suddenly, deterrence is no longer absolute. Other actors in the region may feel emboldened, believing that if Yemen can do it, so can they. That subtle shift in perception can multiply conflicts, provoke new escalations, and make future wars far harder to contain. Another hook emerges when we look at the ordinary Israeli citizen. For years, they have been reassured that no matter what happens on the borders, their cities remain protected. That narrative, reinforced through government statements and visible technological displays like the Iron Dome, has been shattered. When civilians witness fuel depots burning within their own capital, they no longer see war as something distant happening on front lines in Gaza or Lebanon. They see it as something immediate, intimate, pressing into their daily lives. And when civilians feel exposed, political leaders face new pressures, often reacting more aggressively, sometimes even recklessly, to restore a sense of safety. This is where strategic shock translates into political instability, and where one missile strike begins to influence not just military decisions, but the trajectory of national policy. The psychological blow also radiates outward to Israel's allies, for the United States, for European backers, for nations that have invested billions in Israeli defense systems. The question becomes unavoidable: if the technology cannot protect Tel Aviv, what guarantee exists for other cities, other allies, other theaters of conflict? This uncertainty will fuel debates, heighten scrutiny, and force uncomfortable conversations about the limits of military power in the face of determined resistance. What Yemen achieved in that moment was far more valuable than physical destruction. They created a new narrative. They proved that the seemingly untouchable can be touched, that the secure can be exposed, and that the powerful can be humbled. In warfare, narratives are as influential as armies because they shape how populations think, how leaders act, and how enemies plan. The fire in Tel Aviv was not just a blaze of fuel, it was the spark of a new psychological reality in which Israel must confront vulnerabilities it has long denied. The regional and global economic impact of this Yemeni missile strike is something that cannot be brushed aside as merely a localized disruption. Energy is the backbone of every modern economy, and when a strike deliberately ignites fuel warehouses in Tel Aviv, it sends shock waves that extend far beyond the immediate damage. It ripples outward into the regional energy markets, into global trade flows, into the calculations of investors, and into the daily concerns of ordinary citizens who suddenly feel the weight of instability reflected in fuel prices, shipping costs, and currency fluctuations. What makes this strike extraordinary is not simply the destruction of storage facilities, it is the economic theater it creates, where markets respond as quickly as militaries, and where uncertainty itself becomes a weapon. The hook begins with this simple truth: markets hate surprises, and this strike was the ultimate surprise. Overnight, traders in energy markets are confronted with a reality they had not priced in: that Israel's infrastructure, central to both its military and civilian energy needs, is vulnerable to attack. That vulnerability makes investors nervous, and nervous investors shift their capital. Insurance firms that cover tankers and warehouses in the region recalculate their risks, hiking premiums. Shipping companies begin to consider rerouting or demanding higher fees for operations in areas deemed exposed. These costs filter down slowly but surely into the global economy. What begins as a missile strike in Tel Aviv turns into a rise in the cost of shipping goods across oceans, a spike in energy prices for households in Europe, and even shifts in stock markets that react to the perception of heightened instability in the Middle East. This is where the true genius of the strike becomes clear. By targeting fuel depots rather than purely military installations, Yemen managed to hit both the hard and soft underbelly of Israel's strength. Militaries are designed to absorb attacks, to regroup and retaliate. Economies, however, are far more sensitive. They operate on trust, on the belief that tomorrow will be stable enough for contracts to be fulfilled and supplies to flow. Shake that trust, and the costs multiply exponentially. Israel now faces not only the direct loss of valuable fuel reserves, but also the indirect loss of investor confidence, higher import costs, and a more jittery business climate, all of which place pressure on its government in ways bombs alone cannot. The impact stretches further when we consider the broader Middle East. Energy exporters in the Gulf watch this strike with mixed emotions. On one hand, rising energy prices benefit them financially. On the other hand, the perception that missile technology can so easily destabilize major urban energy hubs introduces a long-term risk to their own infrastructure. That uncertainty may encourage these nations to quietly invest more heavily in their own defenses or to rethink their political alignments. For Iran, this moment is validation, proof that asymmetric actors can disrupt larger powers. For Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others, it is a warning that the very pipelines, refineries, and depots that sustain their economies could one day face similar assaults. Globally, the economic consequences are amplified by the delicate balance of energy supply and demand. Europe, still adjusting to energy insecurity after disruptions with Russia, now faces another reminder that the Middle East remains a volatile supplier. Asian markets, heavily dependent on stable shipping through the Red Sea and Persian Gulf, also react nervously. Each spike in risk pushes governments to consider alternative energy sources, to diversify supply chains, and to rethink their reliance on volatile regions. But these are long-term projects. In the short term, consumers will feel the sting through higher prices, companies will feel it in their logistics budgets, and governments will feel it in the pressure of public dissatisfaction. The hook deepens when we realize that this one act did not require Yemen to outspend or outproduce Israel economically. It only required Yemen to demonstrate that it could impose costs on Israel indirectly through global systems. This is the essence of asymmetric warfare applied to economics. When the underdog cannot match its rival dollar for dollar or tank for tank, it targets the rival's vulnerabilities within the global marketplace. Suddenly, Israel finds itself not only fighting Yemen militarily, but also grappling with the unpredictable responses of markets, insurers, and international investors who treat risk as seriously as warplanes. This is where the strike's true power lies, in its ability to connect a local battlefield to the global economy. The burning warehouses in Tel Aviv are not just a regional story, they become a global headline, one that traders in New York, London, and Shanghai cannot ignore. They remind us that in our interconnected world, an attack on fuel reserves in one city can have consequences for fuel prices on the other side of the planet. And in this sense, the Yemeni missiles have achieved far more than destruction. They have reshaped the economic narrative of the conflict, forcing every player, regional and global, to confront the costs of instability in a way that no military strike alone could ever accomplish. The rise of asymmetric power is perhaps the most profound lesson we can draw from Yemen's missile strike on Tel Aviv, because what unfolded was not merely an isolated act of defiance, but a demonstration of how smaller, marginalized nations can reshape the global stage by using innovation and resilience instead of sheer size or wealth. For decades, the dominant assumption in global politics has been that military superiority is measured by budgets, by fleets, by advanced technology manufactured in laboratories of great powers. But history, and now Yemen, teaches us otherwise. Asymmetric power does not rely on matching an opponent tank for tank, missile for missile, or dollar for dollar. It thrives on exploiting vulnerabilities, on redefining the battlefield, on turning weakness into an unexpected kind of strength. And in this moment, Yemen has shown the world just how dangerous that strength can be. The hook begins with perception. For years, Yemen was painted as the archetype of weakness, a nation fractured by civil war, battered by external intervention, and burdened with humanitarian catastrophe. The world saw Yemen as a victim, not as a player. But perception can be a weapon. When your adversary underestimates you, they grow careless. They assume you are incapable of innovation, incapable of striking back in meaningful ways. And then, when the unexpected arrives, when secret missiles rain down on fuel depots in Tel Aviv, the shock is amplified precisely because nobody thought it possible. Asymmetric power thrives on surprise, and Yemen has mastered the element of surprise by weaponizing the very assumptions that dismissed it. The strategic brilliance of asymmetry lies in its cost effectiveness. Israel spends billions maintaining its advanced missile defense systems, yet a single Yemeni strike bypassed them and inflicted disproportionate damage. This is the heart of asymmetric warfare, spending less to achieve more, forcing the opponent to exhaust resources trying to defend every possible target, while you only need one breakthrough to shift the narrative. The economics of this strategy are devastating for the stronger power because it is forced to defend everywhere, while the weaker actor only has to succeed once. It is a chess game where the underdog suddenly places the king in check not by having more pieces, but by using fewer pieces more strategically. Another hook is the psychological power asymmetry generates. When a smaller nation demonstrates the ability to challenge a larger one, it does not just affect the two players directly involved, it inspires others. Across the region and beyond, groups and nations long relegated to the margins are watching closely. They are drawing lessons from Yemen's ability to strike a giant with limited means. They see that determination, secrecy, and innovation can achieve what sheer firepower cannot. This inspiration is itself a multiplier of power because it signals that the global order is no longer defined solely by who has the largest arsenal, but by who can use their limited tools most effectively. We must also understand how asymmetry shifts the burden of fear. Traditionally, weaker nations live in constant fear of stronger ones, fear of bombardment, fear of invasion, fear of sanctions. But when asymmetric power is revealed, the fear begins to flow in the opposite direction. For the first time, it is the stronger nation that must ask, where will the next strike come from? What vulnerabilities have we overlooked? How do we defend against an enemy we underestimated? That reversal of fear is transformative. It destabilizes the confidence of powerful nations and gives smaller actors room to negotiate from positions of unexpected strength. The broader consequence is that asymmetric power disrupts the old hierarchies of global politics. No longer can the strongest nations assume that their dominance is unchallenged. No longer can they operate under the illusion that money alone guarantees safety. Every strike like the one in Tel Aviv reminds us that technology proliferates, that knowledge cannot be contained, and that resilience often outlasts wealth. Yemen's achievement is not just in building a missile, it is in building a narrative that proves the weak can contest the strong, and that in doing so, they can alter the behavior of the powerful. And here is the sharpest hook: asymmetric power creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is itself a weapon. When Israel and its allies wake up unsure of what Yemen can do next, when they are forced to spend billions to guard against possibilities that may or may not materialize, Yemen has already achieved a form of victory. It has bent the will of stronger powers through the fear of the unknown. This is the ultimate power of asymmetry, not simply in what is done, but in what is made possible, in the threat of what might come next. When we examine the wider political consequences of Yemen's unprecedented missile strike on Tel Aviv, we cannot escape the shadow of the United States and its role as Israel's closest and most steadfast ally. For decades, Washington has guaranteed Israel's military superiority in the region, funneled billions in aid, and acted as its diplomatic shield on the international stage. Yet now, for the first time in years, that guarantee is under intense scrutiny. The use of advanced Yemeni missiles that slip through layers of Israeli defense systems is not merely a strike on fuel warehouses, it is a strike on the credibility of U.S. protection. If Israel can be touched at its heart, if Tel Aviv can burn despite the world's most advanced defense systems supplied by Washington, then the promise of absolute security looks increasingly hollow. And that, my friends, is the kind of revelation that shakes alliances to their very core. The Biden administration, already juggling global crises from Ukraine to the South China Sea, now finds itself staring at a dilemma that has no easy solutions. Does it double down on support for Israel, risking a regional escalation that could pull American forces into direct conflict? Or does it quietly urge restraint, trying to prevent another endless war in the Middle East, all while appearing weak in the eyes of its domestic critics? Each choice carries enormous costs politically, economically, and strategically. And make no mistake, every nation watching, from Tehran to Moscow to Beijing, is carefully measuring Washington's response. Will the United States project strength and escalate, or will it reveal hesitation, inviting challenges elsewhere on the global chessboard? The implications extend far beyond the battlefield. Consider the energy markets. With Yemeni missiles striking fuel depots in Tel Aviv, investors are suddenly reminded of how fragile energy infrastructure remains in the modern world. Oil prices spike, insurance premiums for shipping routes through the Red Sea soar, global markets begin to tremble, not because of the scale of the damage in Israel alone, but because of what the attack symbolizes: instability in a region that still powers much of the world's economy. And when markets tremble, political leaders in Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin start to panic. Voters do not forgive higher gas prices. They do not excuse inflation sparked by wars thousands of miles away, which means Yemen's strike has turned into a domestic political problem for leaders far removed from the conflict itself. We must also acknowledge what this means for the shifting global order. For decades, the United States has worked to prevent a multipolar world, one where power is distributed rather than concentrated in Washington's hands. Yet here we see clear evidence that smaller states, with support from larger rivals, can deliver blows that the old world order was not designed to absorb. Yemen, one of the poorest countries in the Arab world, has suddenly demonstrated capabilities that alter global perceptions of power. If Yemen can do this to Israel, what does that suggest about the vulnerabilities of other major powers? Suddenly, the illusion of invincibility shatters. Suddenly, the monopoly of military might that Washington enjoyed seems far less secure. And let's not underestimate the domestic repercussions inside Israel itself. Citizens are asking hard questions of their leaders. How could this happen? How did Yemeni missiles breach the vaunted Iron Dome, the multi-layered missile shields, the intelligence networks funded and supported by the United States? That political pressure inside Israel will inevitably spill over into Washington, where lawmakers will be pressed by lobbyists and voters alike to do something. But doing something could mean escalating tensions to levels unseen in years. And escalation in the Middle East rarely stays contained. It spills over into oil markets, refugee crises, terrorism threats, and global instability. That is the storm now forming on Washington's horizon. So let's be very clear. The Yemeni missile strike is not just a Middle Eastern event. It is a test of U.S. credibility, a test of Israel's resilience, a test of the West's ability to maintain order in an increasingly disorderly world. The hook here, the truth that should keep policymakers awake at night, is this: for the first time in modern history, the underdog has landed a blow that reverberates in Washington as loudly as it does in Tel Aviv. This is not merely about Yemen and Israel. It is about the unraveling of an old security architecture and the dawning of a new era where no power, no matter how mighty, can assume absolute safety. And in that sobering reality lies the future of international politics. As I close, let me leave you with this thought: when warehouses in Tel Aviv burn, the flames illuminate more than just the night sky. They illuminate the reality that we live in a multipolar world where power is no longer monopolized by a few wealthy nations. They illuminate the resilience of those written off as weak, and they illuminate the profound danger of ignoring the voices of people who refuse to be silenced. So I urge you not to dismiss this as just another clash in a faraway land. See it for what it is: a signal, a warning, a historic marker of a world in transformation. And remember, the empires of history did not collapse because of the strength of their enemies alone. They collapsed because they underestimated them. Thank you.